Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. It is time for our 10th annual guest list episode. Now, for the guest list every year, I asked the past year's podcast guests to tell us about the favorite book they read in the past year. It doesn't have to be something, in this case, published in 2022, just something they read and loved. Some of them also told me about which books or authors they hope to read in the year ahead. Now, Hanukkah just started, Christmas is next week, so let's celebrate the whole gift-giving thing by giving ourselves the gift of books that brought us joy or changed our lives in some way. And to all you listeners, I hope you read some good stuff this last year and that you'll find some good books in the year to come. So 21 guests from 2022 responded to this year's invite. Most of them sent in text. A couple of them called in their recommendations. We'll intersperse those. I don't give too much of an intro to the guests, so I hope you'll look up the episode, this episode, and the whole roster of participants in our archives. If you visit chimeraobscura.com/VM, you'll find a link to the guest list 2022, and that has links to just about all of the books or authors mentioned this time around, as well as one to each of their episodes from 22. While you're there, you can also find links to the past editions of the guest list. As I mentioned, this is the 10th annual one, so you got 9 more of these to look at and find great book recommendations from my past guests. And if you're interested in my favorite reads from the past year and my 2023 aspirations, I don't know why, but you might be. I'll tell you those at the end of the episode, okay? Now let's get started. Up first, and I'm doing all these in the order in which they sent them to me, so there's no other rhyme or reason for this. But up first is W. David Marks, author of Status and Culture, How Our Desire for Social Rank Creates Taste, Identity, Art, Fashion, and Constant Change. For 2022, he says his favorite read was Richard Rorty's Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, which addressed my self-doubts about how to live after acquiring the meta-knowledge that there are no metaphysics. For 2023, he says he's going to read more Ernst Gombrich on art and more Leonard B. Meyer on music. The great artist Dave McKean is up next. We talked this summer about Prompt, his Conversations with AI experiment. For 2022, Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. Each chapter, he writes, is an astonishing resetting of how we see our own world, taken from a mycelial point of view. And Heavy Light by Horatio Clare. A journey through madness and the treatment of it, illuminating on why we believe irrational things and why creativity and engagement with nature are such important human activities. I'm pretty sure Dave mentioned Heavy Light in our podcast this summer, and it's on my Amazon wish list, so I need to check that one out. For 2023, he writes, he's going to dive into the fiction of Umberto Eco. He says, several weighty tomes have been sitting on my shelf waiting for the right year, and the works of George Smith, the Assyriologist, for, quote, the world I'm plunging into for a project next year. Our next guest is Daryl Cunningham, whose latest book is Putin's Russia, Rise of a Dictator, which he'll be following up with a graphic bio of Elon Musk, which is to say, Daryl lives on the edge, man. 2022, he writes, my favorite book this year was Life's Work by David Milch. This memoir by the writer-producer of such TV shows as Hill Street Blues, NYPD Blue, Deadwood, and, my personal favorite of his shows, the bizarre surfing drama John from Cincinnati. Warm, wise, and heartfelt, Milch takes a pragmatic view of his years of heroin abuse and gambling addiction. He's a man who made millions, lost millions, and surely should have died several times, but along the way created some of the most innovative TV around. The creative life is at the center of Milch's narrative, and he has much to say about the processes of writing. I don't entirely buy into his thinking on everything, but still enjoy the rich and verbose way he explains his philosophy. For 2023, Darrell writes, "We lost Hilary Mantel this year. I've read the Wolf Hall books, but nothing of her other work, and there are many other novels, 2 short story collections, and a memoir. Planning to tackle these as soon as I've finished the pile of books I'm obliged to read for research for my next book." Our next guest is Eva Hagberg, whose new book is When Eero Met His Match, Eileen Luckheim Saarinen and the Making of an Architect. She writes, "For 2022, my favorite book was The Premonition by Michael Lewis. I am, of course, a huge Michael Lewis fan, but I'll admit I sat on this one. I remember reading The Fifth Risk over a few stints in an infrared sauna in Brooklyn pre-pandemic and loving it, but thinking even Lewis himself couldn't make the pandemic interesting. I was wrong, 4 exclamation points. The Premonition is a classic character study / massively propulsive thriller that completely illuminates both individuals and groups working in other people's best interests, and that lays out what was going on before COVID-19 arrived. I kept finding myself wondering how he structured / reported the book because he's so close to the characters. I started and finished The Premonition while getting to know the tiniest little newborn. I'll never forget how enthralled I was those early mornings, baby in one hand, paperback in the other. I was going to say Eva's new project was When Eero Met His Match, but her new project is actually her newborn child, Roz. For 2023, she says, I'd like to read The Three-Body Problem by Liu Cixin. I think that's how it's pronounced. I'm a fan of operatic science fiction, which this seems like it is, even if it isn't technically space opera, a distinction that reminds me of one of my favorite prints I've ever owned, a massive map of the history of science fiction by Ward Shelley. I'll have a link to that in the show notes for this one. Our next guest is Celia Paul, whose latest book is the wonderful Letters to Gwen John. She writes, I just read such a wonderful book, perhaps you know it, Daybook by the renowned sculptor Anne Truitt. It was republished in 2013 in the U.S. and will be published in the U.K. for the first time next summer. The book is made up of notebook entries from 1974 to 1980. Anne Truitt was inspired to keep a journal after being thrown into emotional turmoil on seeing a retrospective of her work in the Corcoran Gallery in Washington in 1974. Her sculptures looked impossibly self-contained, intact, while in her innermost self she felt dispersed. How to reconcile the outer with the inner? She describes her confusion in these words. It was as if the artist in me had ravished the rest of me and got away scot-free. She decided to simply record her life and see what happened. The result is one of the most powerfully honest and poetically written books I've ever read. At the time of her exhibition in 1974, she was 53 years old and had been 3 years divorced from her much-loved husband, the journalist James Truitt. The separation caused her pain, but the social lifestyle that her husband's job demanded of her clashed with her solitary calling as an artist. Following her divorce, her financial position became unstable. As a single parent to 3 children, she faced extraordinary challenges. Yet somehow she managed to be a dedicated artist and a loving mother at the same time. She seemed able to put both art and family first. She never expresses resentment or rancor. The beauty of her spirit shines through in every sentence she writes. For 2023, I'd like to read her 2 further volumes of journals, which are titled Yield and Prospect. Wallace Wilde-Menozzi is up next. Her most recent book is Silence and Silences. She prefaced this by explaining that it is impossible to choose, but I put her in this position. So, 2022, Nawal el-Saadawi's Memoirs from the Women's Prison, translated from Arabic by Marilyn Booth. She was a leading Egyptian feminist, medical doctor, novelist, and was imprisoned as Director General of Health and Education in Cairo by Anwar Sadat. A classic on women's resistance to state violence and how they formed unlikely alliances behind bars. It is inspiring and informative. Her other fave is Louise Gluck's latest collection, Winter Recipes from the Collective. And on the list for 2023 is John Fosse's Septology. Jim Ottaviani is our next guest. His newest book is the graphic biography Einstein. He's got 3 for 2022. Ducks, 2 Years in the Oil Sands by Kate Beaton, which he writes is far and away the best graphic novel I've read all year. It's subtle, understated, and powerful. To say more would betray the beauty of the book. How to Be Perfect, the Correct Answer to Every Moral Question by Michael Schur, he writes, from the creator of the NBC show The Good Place, this is a brief summary of what he learned about ethics and philosophy, and is funny and serious in the exact right proportions. And A Swim in a Pond in the Rain, in which 4 Russians give a master class on writing, reading, and life by George Saunders. He writes, I would have never read any of these short stories without the promise of Saunders' analysis afterwards, and he delivered every time. The ideas and lessons, yes, lessons, from this book come to mind frequently when I read and when I write. It's terrific. For 2023, Jim writes, I'm going to take a crack at the Library of America's 2-volume set, Lincoln's Speeches and Writings. I was on a Teddy Roosevelt kick a few years ago, so it's time to read the other great Republican president. Nicole Rudick is up next. She had a really amazing book this year. What is now known was once only imagined, an autobiography of Niki de Sanfal. She writes, my list, with the caveat that I can't remember what I read this year and don't really know much of what's coming out next year. Favorite books, Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, How to Be Both by Allie Smith, Punks, New and Selected Poems by John Keene, and rereading nearly all of Joanna Russ's output. She's looking forward to reading The Guest Lecture by Martin Riker, Unshuttered by Patricia Smith, Liliana's Invincible Summer, A Sister's Search for Justice by Christina Rivera Garza, Perennial Fashion Falling Presents by Fred Moten, True Life by Adam Zagajewski, translated by Claire Kavanaugh, The Lost Journals of Sacagawea by Deborah Magpie Erling, and Where I'm Coming From by Barbara Brandon Croft. Ken Crimstein called in his update. His new book is When I Grew Up, The Lost Autobiographies of 6 Yiddish Teens.
Hi, Gil. This is Ken Crimstein, talking about my favorite book or books that I read in 2022. And what I'd like to tackle in 2023. And one book really comes to the top, and it was something that I had tried starting several times, and then I think I went on vacation or something, and I finally pushed through. And it was a long one, and it's called A Soldier of the Great War by Mark Halperin. And it's monumental, magnificent story of a character that spans the 20th century, Alessandro Giuliani, and it's Italy and World War I and fantastic realism, and just I found it captivating. I have tried some of his other things. Winter's Tale, a lot of people talked about, and I kept getting bogged down in it, but this one really appealed to me. Once I got into it, I found it just captivating in many ways. Unexpected and weird and kind of nice. A second one is I just recently read was a collection. It was a graphic biographical history of Robert McNeil, a Marine, and it's called Unsung Hero. And I saw it in 3 parts, published by Dark Horse in 2022, written by Harvey Pekar and illustrated by David Collier. Pekar interviews this soldier from Vietnam. It's quite amazing. It's a 3-part, biography. And I had never seen it before or heard of it. I just picked it up, and I thought it was really, really powerful. For 2023, maybe I'll try and finish some books that I've started, and maybe they'll be great. I'm ashamed to say one of them is Don Quixote. I started it, liked it, got to try and finish it. And the other one I think will be Sometimes a Great Notion, which my great friend Ken Gertz says is the greatest piece of literature ever written, and Ken has read everything. And I just can't, I'm getting there. I'm going to do it. I'm going to finish it. So that's what I've got. Have a great new year, and thanks for everything. Gil, keep doing it.
Jonathan Ames is our next guest. His latest book was The Wheel of Doll, the second book in his series of Happy Doll crime novels. 2022, Killer in the Rain by Raymond Chandler, and The 6 Perfections, The Practice of the Bodhisattvas by Lama Zopa Rinpoche. For 2023, more books by Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Jonathan and I have corresponded a little about Buddhism and the Happy Doll series and a lot of other stuff about life, and that's perfectly in tune with what we've been talking about. Our next guest is David Sachs, author of The Future is Analog: How to Create a More Human World. Favorite 2022, I reread Barbarian Days by William Finnegan. I devoured it when it first came out and gave it to my friend Marco, who I learned to surf with and lives in Venice Beach. Then, last March, I rented a house in Mexico on a surf trip, and it was there in the library. I swapped it out for a book I'd read and reread it, almost as if it was new. I rarely reread and tend to tear through things, so it's amazing how little I remembered, but also how much I noticed the small details and pace and the beauty of the writing. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I plan to reread it every few years. Plan for 2023? Aside from what my book club picks, and we talked about this during his podcast, I want to read more Ursula K. Le Guin. Actually, we read Left Hand of Darkness for the book club a few years back, and it really stuck with me. She's brilliant, and I want more. Richard Butner, author of the short story collection The Adventurists, writes, 2022, my favorite book I read this year that's not by someone I know is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. The setting, the mysteries and revelations, the capitalized nouns, I loved all that. All too often in fiction, the mystery is more interesting than the revelation when the curtain gets pulled back. It's a real disappointment. But not in Piranesi. I think and write a lot about questions like, where is home? And can you return to it? And should you want to? And the ending of Piranesi provides some new answers to those questions. The books I stay most current on are the ones by my friends, so for books actually published this year, my favorites are the novel Booth by Karen J. Fowler, the story collection The Dark Ride by John Kessel, and the novella These Prisoning Hills by Christopher Rowe. All of these folks are great writers who I'm lucky to have as friends. For 2023, just glancing at the teetering to-be-read piles, I see such books as Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi and The Punch-Drunk Encyclopedia by Josephine Machon, the latter being related to my immersive theater obsession. It's probably the year I should tackle Jennifer Egan and David Gilbert, and I will inevitably reread something, maybe another leisurely drive through Lolita. Up next is Glenn Kurtz, author of 3 Minutes in Poland, which was recently adapted into a film. It's hard to say these books are my favorite of 2022 since they're all books I've read before, but they are books I read in 2022 and that I expect I'll reread again and that'll help sustain me. James Merrill, The Changing Light at Sandover. I'm a latecomer to James Merrill, but he immediately became something of a guiding spirit for me. Much as Ephraim, the Ouija board conjured god at the center of The Changing Light of Sandover, is for him. A voice at once conversational, philosophical, intimate, and skittish, with carved phrases that cut deeply. It's a massive, strange, funny, impossible book. The best kind. Javier Cercas, The Imposter. Cercas seeks to uncover the truth of Enrico Marco, Spain's most prominent Holocaust survivor, who was revealed to be a fraud in 2005. In this case, the truth is something like whether Marco knows he's a fraud and what fraud would even mean when examined by a novelist who is himself suffering from imposter syndrome. It's a fearless examination of a kind of moral crime, somehow inextricable with the emotional truth of fiction. And Anne Carson, Knox, N-O-X, an accordion-fold facsimile of a poem/essay/translation/elegy/archive and notes, fragments, photographs, postage stamps, all in which Carson describes the life and death of her brother and translates a poem by Catullus about the death of his brother. I also lost my brother, and I don't know of any work that captures the conflicting emotions of this experience so profoundly. In 2023, I'm looking forward to Olga Tokarczuk's The Books of Jacob. I have a thing for long books these days. Maybe it's a pandemic hangover. As well as the new Cormac McCarthy novels, The Passenger and Stella Maris. Illustrator and artist Joe Chardello writes, a favorite book I read this year is Dangerous Rhythms, Jazz in the Underworld by T.J. English. It's a fascinating look at the history of jazz in America from New Orleans to Chicago to New York and its connection with quote-unquote organized crime. Not just gangsters, but also club owners, record labels, cops, and politicians. Joe doesn't give any 2023 goals, but I'll bet he reads some good stuff next year. The great cartoonist Howard Chaykin, whose Times Squared omnibus will be out someday. We recorded last summer when it was supposed to come out. Anyway, he writes, "I'm afraid I'm going all genre here, Gil. That said, I read all 4 of Allie Monroe's Peter Cotton novels, as well as a short story, and loved her contribution to mid-20th century historic suspense. I was introduced to her work from by a log roll from John Lawton, a longtime favorite of mine, whose new novel in his Joe Wilderness series will appear this spring, and is in fact already pre-ordered by this guy. It might be worth noting that his affection for Monroe's work might be identified by the fact that the detachedly sanguine Peter Cotton would be perfectly at home in Lawton's Joe Wilderness novels, and his Frederick Troy series as well. I also dug Janine Basinger's 1979 monograph, revised for republication in 2007, on Anthony Mann, a director whose work I fucking love. Her observations on this woefully unacknowledged master left me considering and analyzing my own understanding of visual literacy and the creation of pictures and pages endowed with narrative value in my own work. And finally, to my genuine surprise, I dug the hell out of Quentin Tarantino's novelization of his picture Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which I was convinced to read in its mass-market paperback incarnation. The packaging itself, a callback to and reminder of paperbacks contemporaneous with the movie and the novel's subject matter, was a surprising and delightful part of the reading experience. Now, that Joe Wilderness novel he mentions is called Moscow Exile, and it comes out in April 2023. Artist and author Dmitry Samarov, whose new book is Paint by Numbers and is my most frequent guest ever, writes, 2022, probably Dennis Johnson's last posthumous short story collection, The Largesse of the Sea Maiden. This has been a Dennis Johnson heavy year in general, with the release of my favorite movie of the year, Claire Denis Stars at Noon, based on one of his books. Watching that inspired me to revisit Tree of Smoke and to pick up his first one, Angels. Few writers inhabit their troubled heroes as completely as Johnson does. For 2023, I'd like to finish reading Olga Tokarczuk's Bible-like Books of Jacob, but also sort of don't want it to end. At 1,000 pages, it more or less obliges my wish. New York Magazine art critic Jerry Saltz, author of Art is Life, called in his recommendation.
Hi, it's Jerry Saltz, senior art critic for New York Magazine, telling you the best book I read in 2022 was somebody I had never actually read before, Victor Hugo's 93. I bet you've never heard of it. It was published in 1874, and almost all of Hugo is kind of out of print now, except for Hunchback and Les Mis. Anyway, Hugo's terse telling of the power of the unbearable tyrannies of the French Revolution in the provinces of France, the moral pandemonium, the rights of the evil machine called the guillotine, the everyday conciliations made by people who had become animals and thrown into a maw of a fight, a war that they had no knowledge of, those who assuaged their guilt and those who fancied themselves gods. This and the phosphorescent passions of the year 1793, a.k.a. the Terror. That is what this book captures. Just 6 months of life. This book made me know also where Charles Dickens got his act and why, for me, his writing always gets in the way and I see everything coming. In Hugo's writing, ever present too, but it still transports me at least to this englutted other space of humanity. I'm not a big reader, but since reading this Hugo, I'm actually plotting my way through Les Mis and thinking he may be the greatest writer of the 19th century and one of the greatest writers of ever. But again, I'm not a big reader, so don't listen to me. Thank you, Gil Roth.
Ruth Skur, author of Napoleon, A Life Told in Gardens and Shadows, and the sublime John Aubrey, My Own Life, writes, 2022 favorite books this year, Claire Keegan's Small Things Like These. I read this novel 5 times. It is short and word perfect, she writes. Lucy Caldwell's These Days, another Irish writer who has made her name as a short story writer, and Stephen May's Sell Us the Rope, a fun historical novel about Stalin in London in 1907. Looking ahead to next year, really looking forward to the publication of Laura Freeman's Ways of Life, about the Cambridge modern-day Cabinet of Curiosities established at Kettle's Yard by the collector and art critic Jim Eadie, and also to Adam Thirlwell's wild new novel, The Future Future. Now, Ruth's husband, Peter Stoddard, author most recently of Crassus, the First Tycoon, writes, this flashes back to when we recorded in October when I visited Peter and he took me on a boat ride up the Thames from his backyard. So he writes, on the boat this morning, it was -3 degrees with a mist to match. Our trip upstream a few weeks ago is indeed a virtual memory. Maybe my own memory is fading tonight, even without the force of this year's first cold, but my best books of this year are the ones I'm reading right now. Who Saved the Parthenon and The Classical Parthenon, both by William St. Clair from Open Book Publishers. 1,200 posthumous pages by the campaigning British scholar who died in June 2021. From press reports in recent months, it seems clear that the Elgin Marbles, for some while rechristened as the Parthenon Marbles, will before long be again in Athens. Leaving aside all the arguments for retention in London and restitution to the Acropolis, the British Museum needs massive international funding for its own restoration, and international partnerships to borrow and lend exhibits as it needs to do. Both are hindered by the marbles being where they are. Money will make change happen, as it did 200 years ago. So a deal will almost certainly be done, and St. Clair's monumental last testament on the subject, detailed from a vast range of news sources, will help the cause. Next year, I'm going back to all the many poems by Horace that I have previously read without the care needed for the new project I'm about to begin. When Horace was in Athens after the assassination of Julius Caesar, about to join Brutus in his doomed attempt to save the Roman Republic, the Elgin Marbles would have been in their original place on the Parthenon, unseen and almost invisible, but there nonetheless. Not that anyone in the dying debate over their next home will care about that invisibility. Things should go back. That is the order of the day, as demanded by the markets in money and opinion that no one can withstand. Up next is Kathy Koja, author of the immersive novel Dark Factory. My favorite book of 2022, Final Harvest, Emily Dickinson, with an intro by Thomas H. Johnson. It's the book I went back to, the book that solaced me, floored me, and confirmed my admiration and love for Dickinson over and over again. What struck me was her fearlessness in confronting the great trio of loss, love, and eternity, and her tenderness for the wordless here and now. The book I'm looking forward to in 2023, Eugenio Volpi's I, Caravaggio, coming in June from Clash Books. Bad art boy book from a badass indie publisher? What's not to love? Marina Warner, whose latest book is Esmond and Ilia, an unreliable memoir, is up next, and I apologize in advance for how badly I'm going to mangle so many of the names and words in this one. 2022. 2 novels that are both about sublime courage and humanity in conditions of utter wretchedness, both with extraordinary, uncrushable, and deeply appealing female characters. Misericordia by Benito Perez Galdós, translated by Adrian Murdoch, follows the resourceful beggar-woman Benina, and Independent People by Hallador Laxness, translated by James Anderson Thompson, reaches deep into our innermost reserves of feeling with his portrait of Asta Solilya, the infinitely touching and brave daughter of the ferocious patriarch at the center of this book. Agitated Air is a beautiful call and response sequence of variations on Ibn Arabi's love poems, erotic and metaphysical, by Yasmin Seal and Robin Moger, or Moger. It's M-O-G-E-R. Thea Lenarduzzi's Dandelions envelop me in its loving, generous explorations of her diasporic Italian-English family. She faces up to the complexities of politics with a rare sensitivity and steadfastness. For 2023, I want to read Andrei Kurkov's Gray Bees. I love Death and the Penguin, and he has been speaking for the Ukrainian resistance with the strength and conscience I wish writers everywhere would show. I've started Devorah Baum's On Marriage, a trenchant search for the meaning of the institution, both witty and profound. Brian Catling, the performance artist and creator of weird fantasy epics, The Vor, died this year. He was a huge character in more ways than one, and inspirationally above all. He has left a posthumous novel, Hollow, which I shall read and marvel at, I feel sure. Washington Post art critic Sebastian Smee is our final guest. He offers up 2022, John Fosse, Septology 1 through 7. 2023, Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry. Now, for me, it's funny. At the end of last year's episode, I said the two books I was really looking forward to were from Haley Campbell and Celia Paul. Lo and behold, those were two of my absolute faves this year. Haley's All the Living and the Dead, from embalmers to executioners, an exploration of the people who have made death their life's work. Man, that book. It starts as a sort of journalistic exploration of the people who handle the dead. Well, all the different people in the chain of custody, as it were, the people who actually deal with us after we're gone. And then it becomes absolutely devastating. And it's handled masterfully with real empathy for the people Haley is profiling and the ways in which they cope with their jobs and what it means to handle the formerly living people. And similarly, even when she finally tips over the edge and falls into despair in this really horrifying episode of the book, Haley manages to avoid the trap of what we call millennial memoiring. Doesn't fall into self-pity, doesn't reveal too much about herself, but instead gets at the universal aspects of grief and the terror of death, but not of death itself, but the death of others, those we can't protect. And it all makes for an absolutely astonishing book, All the Living and the Dead. I talked about it extensively in our podcast episode. I'll say here, I'm sorry that Haley had to go through what she went through to bring it to us, but I'm awfully glad we have this book. It's changed how I see the living and the dead. And it gives me some, I don't want to say hope, some sense of what it means to be human, I think, that she really evokes over the course of that book. It's a remarkable achievement. Now, the other one I mentioned was Celia Paul's new book, which is Letters to Gwen John. And that one sort of expands on Celia's 2020 book, Self-Portrait, in its exploration of art and femininity and memoir. It's a haunting book about the life of, I'd say the life of an artist, the life of two artists, Celia and Gwen John, and the parallels between John's relationship with Rodin and Celia's with Lucian Freud, who she, again, wrote about in Self-Portrait. Both of her books reveal more about the life of an artist, the inner life and the quotidian, and the experience of seeing and making, and not just the moment of inspiration, but all the work that goes into preparing for art and making it, and that whole flux. She brings all that together more than most anything I've ever read. And it's also a beautifully produced book, just like Self-Portrait, with these gorgeous reproductions of art. It, it's as a biased straight white male, etc., makes me, radically reconsider art, the relationships of men and women, and why certain art is privileged over other types of art. And it just exposed me to new work and new lines of thought. It's a really wonderful book. So Letters to Gwen John by Celia Paul. And in a sense, it sort of dovetails with another book I really adored this year for the podcast, Julie Phillips' The Baby on the Fire Escape. Creativity, Motherhood, and the Mind-Baby Problem. I won't go into it too much, but it's, again, a collection of pieces about women, mothers who were artists of various kinds, writers, painters, etc. And Julie does a really amazing job with these profiles and what they say about the way women have been constrained and how those things have changed in recent years. Anyway, The Baby on the Fire Escape, Julie Phillips, another great one. The other really great book for my pod reading, and these are all books related to the podcast. I'll go into my extracurricular reading after this. But the other top one, the one that I just am so happy I got to read this year, is John Aubrey, My Own Life by Ruth Skur. See, I read Ruth's new book on Napoleon for our podcast. I mentioned that one in her segment earlier. But I also went back and read this one from 2015, and good Lord, it is so amazing. Friends have been posting about it, especially past guest Levi Stahl. He has posted bits from this book for years, and I keep thinking, oh, yeah, I should read that. I don't understand what it is exactly. I'm not quite clear. What it is that Ruth took the archives of John Aubrey, the 17th century English figure, sort of best known for his brief lives of other great figures. And through the archive, she manages to put together his chronological autobiography using his own words, not extrapolating, not writing new segments or imagining where he would have gone and the stuff he did, but taking everything that was there and building the autobiography he never made. It's well, again, I've been meaning to get to it for years before I really got what it was. And then Nicole Rudick mentioned it in our podcast about her book, What Is Now Known Was Once Only Imagined, an autobiography of Niki de Saint Phalle, which uses a similar method. And once I understood what that was through talking with Nicole, I'm like, oh yeah, I should start this. So once I got Ruth lined up for the Napoleon book, I dived into John Aubrey, My Own Life. It just floored me. It is such an amazing achievement, and what she does with Aubrey's own words, the beauty of his writing, but the way she manages to construct the entirety of his life around that, it's absolutely phenomenal. It's a really, really incredible book. Other ones, Ira Nadel's Philip Roth, A Counterlife, different approach, literary biography. Very impressive work of scholarship and writing. I really enjoyed it. Learned a lot about Roth that Roth maybe wouldn't have wanted people to learn. I'm very glad I read this one instead of the authorized Roth bio by Blake Bailey, about which we're not going to say anything. There were a couple of other books that I read for the podcast that really moved me this year. Andrew Jameson's Midlife, Humanity's Secret Weapon. That one got me thinking a lot about midlife, and Jung, and how we get past the wound. Andrew and I stayed in touch for a bit after the podcast, and it wasn't exactly therapy, but it helped me, change some perspectives on certain aspects of myself. Daryl Pinkney's memoir, Come Back in September, is just absolutely wonderful, filled with literary hot goss, covers great stuff about Elizabeth Hardwick, Susan Sontag, people from the 70s into the very early 80s in literary New York circles. And it's just gorgeously written and an awful lot of fun to read. Nicole Rudick's book on Niki de Saint Phalle, I continue to go back to and look at, I try and recapture some of the artistic inspiration I was getting when I was reading it, which is always tough to capture that spontaneous thing. But the book did it the first time, and it's helped me out a few times since then. I also love John Crowley's Flint and Mirror. It's a novel. If it turns out to be his coda, basically, which he strongly implied in our conversation about it, then it's a beautiful book to go out on. I was having dinner with John and Judith Clute in London back in October, and we talked a little about this one, and Judith just said, it just feels like the summation of all of these threads of John's novels over the years, and how he brings it all together in this slim novel compared to some of his big ones. So yeah, Flint and Mirror, by John Crowley. Really enjoyed it. The Latinist by Mark Prins was also a blast of a novel. Because I've been citing all of these nonfiction books, I figured I'd give you a couple of novels too. So The Latinist, I enjoyed the heck out of. There were more books that I loved from this year from my guests, but there were a lot of them, and I'm really trying not to go on and on and on and on and on and on and on this time around. So if you were a guest and I didn't mention your book too, just assume it was the very next one I was going to talk about. But I want to get to the extracurricular reading also, the books I read for fun, quote unquote, as opposed to for pod guests. I didn't get too much of that in because I really did a lot of reading for the show this year. But there were 3 that absolutely walloped the living heck out of me, and I want to tell you about them. The first is Old Poets, Remembrances and Opinions by Donald Hall. That's a reissue of Their Ancient Glittering Eyes. I have both editions. I had the original one, and then I looked into this one, picked it up. Anyway, don't worry. It's Old Poets, Remembrances and Opinions. It's a collection of essays about Donald's experiences and encounters with great poets from before his time, basically. Robert Frost, Dylan Thomas, T.S. Eliot, Marianne Moore, in one of the most comedic passages about encounter between 2 poets ever, and Ezra Pound. And I think there are a couple of others. Ivor Winters, I think, plays in there also. But the Pound chapter, I hate using haunting, but it's haunting. And it inspired a mini essay out of me called Fragments, which is one of the first times in a long time I felt like I found my fastball again as a writer. And anything that can inspire me that much, I'm I'm going to praise the heck out of. But these essays, his poems are great. He's a poet laureate in the U.S., but I find his prose just remarkable. He's got an essay in Essays After 80 called One Road that is one of my favorite pieces of writing. These essays about a poet, we'll say, wrestling with his precursors and going through these different ways of meeting them and finding himself as a poet in the process. Well, they reveal an awful lot about what it takes to make great art and how badly it can wound the soul. And I bought a bunch of copies of Old Poets, as well as I was in a used bookstore and picked up these Ancient Glittering Eyes to give to friends after this if I ever see any of my friends again. Now, I did not buy copies of this next one for anyone else because I just don't know. I can't imagine many people would treat it as anything other than Gil being an asshole and giving us a big snooty doorstop. It's Against the Day by Thomas Pynchon, his 2007 novel. Over the years, I owned it in hardcover. I read a dozen pages, sold it, bought a paperback a couple of years ago, never opened it. And then I picked it up on my Kindle when it was like $2.99 on sale. And one night this year, I decided to give it a try. And Against the Day is nearly 1,100 pages long. And I thought, boy, if I just read the equivalent of like 10 to 15 pages a night, I'll make it through this in like 3 or 4 months, which is long term as far as I'm concerned. But, it seemed like a project. And even more than most Pynchon novels, and I can now say I've read all of them, this one's impossible to explain or even describe. It takes place from the 1890s to a little after World War I in a world that kind of resembles ours. I mean, it's ours, but there are elements of the fantastic in it, like a troupe of teens, I guess, who travel the world in blimps in search of adventure. And there's a type of optical crystal that may refract people into parallel Earths or split them into 2 versions of themselves. It's not quite clear, and that's part of the point. Counter Earth makes an appearance near the end, which is great because I was working on a memoir / poem / short story about Counter Earth for a couple of weeks on and off, and when this showed up near the end of Against the Day, I thought, oh, thank God, I don't need to work on that anymore. What it's about. It is, Against the Day is about what all Pynchon novels are about, which is control. and the counterforce of anarchy. Where Gravity's Rainbow used the arc of a rocket, and Mason and Dixon used cartography as sort of the metaphors for this. This book uses optics and explosives and the state of science in the 1890s, the notion of ether. These things are all kind of mixed up, but I guess we'll just say optics as the force that helps define that struggle. What goes on? I don't even know how to tell you what some of the book is like. An anarchist blows up railroads, and he gets murdered by the railroad owners, and his sons do and don't pursue revenge. The dead rise. There's weird sex. There is turn of the century espionage. There's travels through Eastern Europe leading up to and into World War I. There's song and dance, as there always is in a Pynchon book. There's Shambhala and Counter Earth. Like I mentioned, there is the Under Earth. You can get to the North Pole through by going underneath the planet. It's weird. It's joyous and immense and erudite and crude, and it's a thrill ride that's loving and hating and about family, which deep down is sort of what Pynchon gets at in a lot of his books, both the family we start with and the families we make. There's no way to do it justice. And you'll never keep all the characters and plots straight. It's okay. You don't have to. You'll discover worlds within and without yourself in the course of reading this book. I think I did. And if you're at all like me, you're going to feel lost when it's done. You're going to finish and just return to the immanent world, I guess. And in my case, I've been sort of looking for something else that'll help reimmerse me. And I thought DeLillo's Underworld might be at that 800 pages or so from around 1999, I guess. But I found it so boring, I gave up about 250 pages in. But one book, and this is the third book I'm praising among my extracurricular reading, that did give me that sense of living in another world, was actually a piece of nonfiction. Joseph Anton, the memoir of Salman Rushdie. I started that one right after Rushdie was attacked, and it just swallowed me up for 700 pages. It is absolutely breathtaking piece of writing, told in the third person about an experience it is just impossible to imagine, much less live through, as Rushdie and people in his life did. He really relates what it was like to live in hiding and to need clearance from his protectors for most any activity, and to have this go on for years, and to keep trying to find places he could stay temporarily, and what it meant when they finally found a place to buy that he could live in, and how they had to hide his ownership of it so that he wasn't targeted by assassins from Iran. And he also goes into the dissolution of his marriage, and then another, and never spares his personal responsibility, except maybe with Padma Lakshmi. It did feel a little vindictive at that point, but that was the most recent one that dissolved. And he shows the receipts of the people who argued that he brought the fatwa on himself and, quote unquote, should have known better, and, was irresponsible, and basically the people who would say they're for free speech, but, watch what you say, I guess. It's really a breathtaking piece of memoir. There are moments of joy. There's some moments of absolute terror. The mundanity of it, what it really meant to be in that world where everything had to be cleared and your security was paramount, but it was so restrictive. It's incredible. Peter Stoddard, who I referred to with that little trip up the Thames earlier in the episode, during that trip, he told me about, I guess, a birthday dinner or an event dinner. That's right. It was one of Rushdie's first public appearances. Peter helped put together when he was the editor of the Times of London. And they had a dinner afterwards, and they had to have it in the basement of this restaurant because the security guys wouldn't approve all these other venues they wanted to use, and this is where they had to go. And Peter was sitting there thinking, oh, my God, this is the most restrictive a horrible thing. We're completely constrained. We had to go through all these hoops to get here. And in that moment, he realized, boy, to Salman, this is probably the most liberated he's felt in the longest time. It's probably been years since he's felt this free, and the rest of us feel like we're completely imprisoned. What must he be going through? And the book really captures that. It's amazing. So Joseph Anton by Salman Rushdie. Anyway, it's really a testament to the resilience of a person, much less an artist. I mean, how we managed to go through this year after year with all these restrictions and all this anxiety and still write is just mind-blowing. I say this as someone who, can't bring himself to write on a good day. So Old Poets, Against the Day, and Joseph Anton are my big three. And like I said, I didn't get to do an awful lot of extracurricular reading because there's a lot of pod reading to do. But in the beginning of the year, I reread a couple of old reliables, Mrs. Dalloway, The Good Soldier, and Invisible Cities. And they didn't disappoint. I also tackled Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy for the first time. Boy, was that tough. I know I need to reread it, but I just don't want to subject myself to it again. And not in it's a bad book way, is more of in a soul-destroying way. Saramago's Blindness, liked it, a little too long. Seemed very apropos for the last few years, and not just the pandemic years, but the ones before that. I haven't read the sequel yet, but I have that on my Kindle. On Yom Kippur, I read Oliver Sacks's Gratitude and Anatole Broyard's Intoxicated by My Illness. I seem to do that now ever since getting my own diagnosis. On Yom Kippur, I read books written when the authors knew they were dying. And my whole experience on Yom Kippur and the days and weeks after were very, very strange and involved, and I don't want to go into it here. But both of those books helped lay the groundwork for some of that transformation, especially the notes in Broyard's book. The finished pieces were good, but the notes toward the last thing he planned to write, I found really, really compelling, maybe in their incompleteness. I don't know. Anyway, so that's pretty much it. You can find the list of every darned book I've finished since 1989 over at my site, which is chimeraobscura.com/VM. It's under all the books I've read. 1989 is when I started college, and that's when I started writing down just the non-comics, the prose and poetry books. So the funny thing is, for 2023, I always ask everybody else what their challenge is. I have no idea what I'd read for 2023. I have an awful lot of podcasts already lined up and a lot of books to read for them. And I haven't planned out any big reading campaigns in the extracurricular sense. I do want to read Morning Diaries, Mourn, by Roland Barthes. Celia Paul gave me a copy of that when I visited her on my stop in London this fall. That might fit into the Yom Kippur books by dying people, and this would be sort of adjacent to that. Looking over my shelves, I should probably read more Virginia Woolf, who I've never really explored. I started last year with Mrs. Dalloway. I should probably finally get through To the Lighthouse and A Room of One's Own and start really exploring Woolf, who I got turned off to in high school by a teacher who gave us The Waves, which is just the wrongest of her books to start someone off with, I think. So I should do that. Maybe I'll try Olivia Manning's Fortunes of War trilogies. It's either that or a third go-round with Anthony Pohl's Dance to the Music of Time. I'll have to see. I'd like to read more of Donald Hall's essays. I picked up a few more of his collections right after Yom Kippur as part of that weird transformational week. Again, I'll tell you all about that some other time. I've got some Marina Warner essays that are beckoning also, pieces about art and art criticism that I picked up when I was in London right before I met up with her to record. And I bought the collected Emily Dickinson in November after my visit to my college town to once again record a podcast, but during which I stumbled across Dickinson's grave. And I've never really given her a fair shake in a real reading. And Kathy Koja said such great stuff about her. I really need to dive back in there too. And maybe I'll read more poems in general. I say that most years, but I never follow through on it. The problem is I have to get over reading for the sake of numbers, which is what I invariably devolve into in a lot of aspects of my life, but especially reading. This year, for example, the spreadsheet where I keep that list of all the books lists 62 books finished, and it's only, as I do this, December 18th. There are a couple of others I'm in the process with. That's too much. Not all of them were against the day length. Some of them were, like that Oliver Sacks is maybe 70 pages and very generous margins. But I tend to fall into that numbers trap, and I need to read for depth and not just for proving that I've read more than you have. But we'll see how next year goes. And that's it for the 2022 edition of the Virtual Memories Show guest list. Thanks for sticking around, and thanks for listening throughout the year. This year's been maybe a little less heavy than the past few. I mean, I've gone through some things, but, there seems to be light at the end of the tunnel. I've managed a couple of celebrations, like the 10th anniversary of my very first interview for the podcast and my 500th episode, which was, that was something. I still look back on that particular show with a lot of joy and a lot of exhaustion. And then this one is the 10th annual guest list. I've done 10 of these things, man. This is something, right? As ever, you can support this podcast by telling other people about it. And just tell them there's this guy putting out this neat podcast every week. And every year he does this neat guest list show where everybody talks about the books they loved. And well, just try and support the show in the year ahead, because things are going to get weird when it comes to publicizing it via various social media platforms. You can also help out the show by letting me know what you like and don't like about it, who you'd like to hear me record with, what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or art or theater or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by writing me, send me a postcard or a letter, send me an email, direct message, leave me a message on my Google Voice number like Ken Crimstein and Jerry Saltz did this time around. That's 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go over that, just call back and continue rambling on. And let me know if it's cool to use your message in an upcoming episode of the show. I might have something that would be really great to share with the listeners, but I would never do something like that without getting the speaker's permission. If you've got money to spare, don't give it to me. I do just fine. I'm going to start a Substack in 2023, which will be free, but also have a $5 tier. I'll figure out what the benefits are for the $5 thing, but basically it'll be the $5 will offset the actual amount of work that's going to go into producing some different sort of material. I think transcripts of past episodes and more writing, and we'll see what it all comes out to. Anyway, don't give me money now. Give money to people in need. There are people, institutions also that, well, if you've got any resources to spare, could really use your help. With individuals, go through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Topato Go, Crowdfunder, other platforms like that, because there are people who need help with medical bills, rent, trying to get artistic projects off the ground, and all sorts of other stuff. When it comes to institutions, I give to my local food bank. I also give to my former colleges. I give to the CLL fund. We had Giving Thursday or Giving Tuesday, whatever the hell day it was, sometime after Thanksgiving. And I donated to the fund for the type of leukemia that I have. But there are other things you can do. There are all different institutions and foundations out there. There's the Poor People's Campaign. There are freedom funds or election funds or women's choice funds. You can make targeted election contributions. There's an awful lot you can do to try to help build a better world. So I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.